Hi there. I'm going to finish the preface of On Quality by Robert and Pirsig, and this is me reading it in its entirety and making some comments. There's some stuff I didn't know about Robert Pirsig. I've looked at a lot of biographical material as much as I could find, and there's a few things that I didn't actually know before, so that's pretty cool. And of course, this is through the lens of Wendy Pirsig. She wrote this section, who knew him better than anyone ever, and that is pretty cool. What's in this book is the next section. The purpose of this book is to bring readers, old and new, in contact with Bob's quest to develop a quality-based worldview. So this is on quality. I mean, in metaphysics of quality, there are a lot of factors, but quality is, of course, the essential factor, the main thing, the one, the essence of it all. So I'm going to read that again. The purpose of this book is to bring readers, old and new, into contact with Bob's quest to develop a quality-based worldview. And, of course, the worldview we have is roughly materialistic. There are objects in the world. They're already there. We discover them. And how we categorize these objects that are already there is truth. And that is certainly not Robert Pirsig's philosophy. Along with selected excerpts from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Lila, it offers examples never published before, which is what makes this book really, one of the things that makes this book really cool, of his writings elsewhere on quality and his understanding of its meaning. Bob's quest began in 1961 when, at age 32, he was teaching college English in Montana, and his philosophical ideas solidified. And if you've read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, you remember that section where he was trying to grab the bull by one horn and then the other, and he discovered that it wasn't one horn or the other, it was something beyond both. There is a passage here written years before his books from Bob's letter to college teachers in Western states about how they could encourage students to find quality in their own work. There are some of the extensive notes he wrote early in 1962 while hospitalized for schizophrenia at Downey Veteran Administration Hospital in Illinois after abruptly leaving the University of Chicago. Okay, so that particular part, I'm just going to tell you in advance that these notes that he wrote in the hospital are really they distill the essence of what he was working on in a way that really kind of gives a clarity to his work that I haven't experienced with other writing. So I really love that section. I'm enthusiastic to share that with you. This book includes some of Bob's writing and letters to readers, interviews, especially in the early 1990s after Lila was published, and contributions to such other works as Guidebook to the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Ronald L. DeSanto and Thomas J. Steele, and Lila's Child, the anthology compiled by Dan Glover in 2002. Guidebook to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is a really useful tool to understanding Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, primarily because it breaks down the philosophical traditions evoked by Bob Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. If you don't know all about Hume, and if you don't know all about Plato, or at least in the sense that he evokes in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and several other people, these guys break it down so you can understand the essence of the parts of these philosophies that help you understand how Pirsig was using classical philosophy in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. That's one thing that makes it really useful, so you don't have to read the history of philosophy like Robert did in order to get what he's talking about. That's one reason it's a useful companion. There's other reasons too. There's material, that before that hadn't been published. So for a Pirsig fan, that's a really nice tool. Lila's Child is an anthology of, kind of like this corner. There was a group of diehard Pirsig fans, and Pirsig was alive at the time, so he was in contact with them to some extent. And they were trying to parse out metaphysics of quality. And in online forums, and this was, when the late 90s, when the internet was kind of a new thing. And you can still see the archives on moq.org. It's interesting in the sense that you've got a bunch of smart guys, a lot of them philosophy students, who are trying to make sense of metaphysics of quality, which has a difficult time fitting into classical philosophy, and they're trying to make sense of it. And then you have this whole moral component with the levels that they're trying to, understand and apply to reality. So that's an interesting. It's a strange book because it's not, it's a compilation of all these online discussions. So it's an unusual book for the time, at least. I mean, I think there's probably more things like this these days, I suppose, since this was an earlier part of the internet. But it's a bit rough going in a way because it's other people's opinions about Pirsig's work, which can be useful or not depending on where you're coming from it. Obviously, overall, it's a great tool. I'm not trying to dismiss it in any way. It's just you go down rabbit holes with this book, which maybe something you want to do, and another thing about Lila's Child is you really feel palpably the enthusiasm for Pirsig's work at the time, and that is really something I wish would happen again. And it was lovingly compiled by Dan Glover, who did a beautiful job putting it together, putting together all this disparate conversation into something that was actually coherent. And Robert Pirsig wrote, I can't remember now, I'm sorry, but I think he wrote the introduction. He wrote at least some significant part. He interacted with this group and wrote something, either the preface or the introduction to this book. All right, Bob did not make many public appearances. We know he was an introvert. We know he was sort of a recluse. But some of those rare occasions are represented here. In 1975, he gave a lecture to raise funds for the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. He spoke at a conference of the Association for Humanistic Psychology in 1992. In 1995, he addressed a gathering of artists and scientists from around the world at the Free University of Brussels and proposed that understanding value or quality as the basic component of the universe could allow scientists to solve a number of irreconcilable theories in modern physics. The irreconcilable theories, you remember in Lila, are the platypi, these conundrums, these philosophical conundrums that are conundrums simply because they aren't looking at the problem through the right lens. Once you look at any problem through the lens of quality, they make sense. But that's too simple for most people. And this is one of the reasons metaphysical quality hasn't caught on. It just doesn't, it seems so simple that it seems, impossible. And unless you are in that mindset, in the quality mindset, like he says, the quality-based worldview, you're simply going to discount it. And that's what many people have done with Pirsig's work, which is such a shame. Because perhaps nature is simpler than you think it is. Perhaps the universe operates, because we see the complexity of the outcome of these processes, we assume the processes themselves are complex, and perhaps they're not. Attentive readers might note inconsistencies here in the capitalization of the word quality. Bob's first writings used the lowercase. When he wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he began using an uppercase Q, except in instances of the more definable traditional uses of quality. When he wrote Lila, he termed the latter use static quality, covering any pattern of one-sided fixed values. Another thing about static quality, he said, is that anything you find, any noun, anything you find in the dictionary is a static pattern of value. The term dynamic quality represented the source of all things, the pre-intellectual cutting edge of reality. So in this corner, we're talking a little bit about Neoplatonism, and we're trying to reconcile a humanistic view, a secular, agnostic view with the religious worldview. This is exactly where I think Pirsig can really be useful in the same way that Neoplatonism can. The source of all things, the pre-intellectual cutting edge of reality. This collection of excerpts usually retains the capitalization used in the respective originals. This book is arranged in 5 sections. Quality, introducing Bob's discovery of its central importance. Values, the heart of the topic from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The metaphysics of quality, the philosophical system expounded in Lila. Dharma, sampling parallels to dynamic quality from Hinduism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And attitude, seeking the essence of non-dualism through metta, a term used in Buddhism, or love, as it is known in the West. All right, I'm going to stop for a minute there and point to love in terms of some of the Christian and Platonic traditions we're looking at, where a draw towards the good, the draw itself, love, is an essential tenet of the way of seeing those respective philosophies. Readers may find the material in each section progressively challenging. It's worth remembering here that these are difficulties that Bob grasped with himself. This is another thing about Pirsig that is really great in his books, is that he talks you through his own psychological turmoil in this quality-driven desire for understanding the true nature of existence, reality, and through the quality lens. And to see someone struggle with it, so I know he's a genius, but you still see him struggling, and you see him struggling in a way that you can relate to. And because he's such a great writer, he outlines the steps he goes through in a way that someone who is not a genius can ride along with him and understand. Difficulties that have stymied thinkers since the beginning of philosophy that can't be resolved using normal, rational thinking at all. Many photographs appearing in On Quality and on the book's jacket depict a selection of Bob's tools. They were photographed in 2020 by the artist David Lindbergh, Bob's nephew. They're beautiful photographs, and this is another reason why you should get the hardback. Okay, so the last part of the preface is a short biography of Robert Pirsig. A loosely chronological presentation of Bob's life and writings is threaded through the text of On Quality. Although Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is presented as fiction, it traces much of Bob's life up to and including an actual 1968 motorcycle trip. Lila is largely fictional, except for the sailboat and metaphysics, and the plot is short in duration, so perhaps a brief biography is in order, which I will attempt to summarize here. And I, of course, is Wendy Pirsig, who, again, knew him better than anyone else. And so there's going to be a personal feeling to this biography, which I found to be the case. There's going to be stuff that if you've looked at other Pirsig resources, you're going to recognize, but there's some interesting things in here that you may not have known. That's what I found kind of cool about this. Robert Maynard Pirsig was born in 1928 in Minneapolis to Maynard Pirsig and Harriet Sjobeck Pirsig. Maynard was a farm boy who became dean at the University of Minnesota Law School and a highly regarded law professor. Harriet was a university graduate whose early life had been marred by abuse. I just want to take a brief second to comment on that. So, Pirsig's mother survived what we would say today had childhood trauma. And as we know these days, that can really influence the ability to mother. It doesn't mean that someone with trauma is going to be a poor mother, not by any stretch of the imagination. But considering that young Robert was a very, sensitive young person, there might have been something in there. Now, we can attribute certain aspects of his problems, again, to his very, very high IQ, which isn't necessarily a good thing for a kid. But that's kind of interesting that his mother had suffered from what you would call adverse childhood experiences. They raised 3 children. The parents rise from their roots in early 20th century German and Swedish immigrant families was the context for their celebrating Bob's achievements as an early reader and chess player, despite evidence of emotional vulnerability. This is what I'm actually referring to. I jumped the gun a little bit on that. When he was 10, he was given an intelligence test that ranked him in the highest percentile, 170 IQ, 175, something like that. Bob's admission to the University of Minnesota at age 15 as a chemistry major ended in failure, however, and he enlisted in the Army in 1946. It was one of many examples in his life of stuckness, leading to a broadening of understanding, as he wrote later. Now, one thing I like about this section coming up is it was outlined in Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and this was the period where he came in contact with quality, the essential element or a non-element of his philosophy. So you're going to find some familiarity here, but there's also some things you probably don't know. And stuckness is certainly something he suffered during this period, which is interesting because this is where, the idea of quality began to rear its head into his psyche. It was one of the many examples in his life of stuckness leading to a broadening of understanding, right? As he wrote later, stepping off the train in South Korea when the troops first arrived, he saw a dusting of snow over the nearby mountains that was so beautiful and strange and reflected such a different culture that he became almost ecstatic. I walked around. It was like Shangri-La, he recalled years later. I think I was crying. I just stared at the roofs, wondering what kind of culture could have built roofs like that, he said. And that is the day, that day is what started me turning toward everything in Asia. Remember, in Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he has this latent memory that eventually comes to the fore, and that's of the Korean Wall. And we're talking about the Korean roofs, but the walls and the roofs are very much related. If you do a Google search of Korean walls and roofs, and you're going to find something quite beautiful, quite organized, but not rigid. Something that indicated to him quality. And in that wall and those roofs is a metaphor for what we will come to know as the quality, the Pirsig notion of quality. In the header on my channel is a picture of one of these Korean walls. So maybe you can get the gist from that. Now, one thing about that picture is there's some repairs to that wall, and I was unable to find a picture that did not have repairs. The repairs are low quality. The roof is very high quality. And there's a metaphor in there of, repairing something in a kind of half-assed way. Like the motorcycle mechanics who just kind of hurry through the day and doing something really well. So if you look at the header, you're going to see the beautiful wall and you're going to see some kind of shitty repairs. After his discharge 2 years later, he completed a BA in philosophy at the University of Minnesota, then headed to India in 1950, hoping to penetrate Hindu philosophy at Benares Hindu University. Finding the material and cultural shock difficult, he started missing classes and slid into depression, kind of like he did in college, but for different reasons. Suffering extreme weight loss. He was rescued by an American friend and fellow student John Plott, an Oklahoman, who had also been training in yoga. Another Midwest, is Oklahoma the Midwest? Maybe not so much, but still one of those more traditional American states, so maybe a similar thing that they were coming out of, escaping, let's say. John located the owner of a water buffalo who was willing to bring his animal to Bob's house every day and provide fresh milk, which John cooked with oatmeal until Bob's spirits and weight recovered. John later attained a PhD from Benares, became a professor of philosophy at Marshall University, and wrote a 5-volume global history of philosophy. Bob's experience of impasse in India led to his openness to insights he couldn't gain in the classroom. All right, I'm just trying to mull over that a little bit. So that is the stuckness leading to a broader understanding, I guess you could say. And on Karen Wong's channel recently, well, if you're watching this way after the fact, it's not going to be recent, but she said barrier or obstacle is the most necessary thing for growth. It's a blessing. Back in Minnesota, to complete a master's in journalism, Bob met his wife, Nancy James. Now, this part I really like. It's interesting. I didn't know this. In 1954, they went on the road together through the American West and to Mexico, working in a gambling casino, writing fiction, and attempting to build an ocean-going sailboat. When they returned, they had 2 sons, Chris and Ted. Bob found he was more suited to technical writing than newspaper work. In 1959, he accepted a teaching position at Montana State College in Bozeman, Montana, a step potentially leading to an academic career that could mirror his father's. But Bob wasn't suited to teaching as his father had been. Years later, he recalled episodes of stage fright, walking to work each morning. He recalled episodes of stage fright walking to work each morning, to the point of physical illness. But he cared deeply about academic ideals. I would say that he cared about ideals in general. He was a very conscientious person and worked not only to teach, but to analyze the formal learning experience, the experience he had often struggled with as a student and now struggled with as a teacher. Why so often did students approach him wanting to know what he wanted for an assignment? What should he tell them, he wondered, and why didn't they know without being told? That's a good question. Let's just jump the gun on this a little bit. What he's noticing is a way of seeing reality in which intuition has long been discounted. And the ability to detect quality is just not a skill anymore. You have to match up what you're doing with the rubric, with what's required. And that's going to end up being, that will be part of the problem. That will be part of the dualistic nature of subject-object metaphysics. It was there on campus, as he pondered these questions at the end of an afternoon in Montana Hall, that a respected senior colleague named Sarah Vinke happened by watering plants. "I hope you are teaching quality to your students," she remarked in a friendly way. I think he said something about a sing-song voice. Quality, that's what he was trying to teach. Quality is what he wanted in their papers, the quality they can't define, but that surrounds them. So that's saying the quality surrounding us too. That's an interesting insight. Think about that one. He developed classroom methods to bring this realization to his students. He began talking about it with his colleagues and experimenting with the elimination of grades and writing about it. Elimination of grades and writing about it. But the more he thought about the importance of quality, it wasn't just his students and educators whom Bob wanted to awaken. It was academic philosophers like those from whom he had earned a degree. And it was everyone. He wanted to upend human thinking, to bring quality into the center of civilization's consciousness. We infer this from Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and from Lila, but here is his wife of 40 years putting it in black and white. He wanted this to be the philosophy by which we operate. And slowly in this little corner and hopefully out in the world, what he was trying to do is kind of beginning to manifest, with quality being value being at the center of consciousness. And you can see this in the patrons, the theories we're following in this corner. You're going to see this dynamic as a commonality, where we're looking at value versus objects that are already out in the world. Leaving Montana in 1961 to begin graduate work at the University of Chicago, Bob waded into one of the most challenging academic programs in the country, and he found his ideas made little headway. Big surprise. Financially stressed, teaching in a Chicago community college while burdened with the demanding PhD program that sought to define the good in its intellectual relation to things. Perfect, isn't it? Sought to define the good in its intellectual relation to things. He again found himself paralyzed. So he runs up against good being subsumed as something that can be categorized and measured against something else. Like those kids are trying to say, well, the good will be measuring my essay against what the teacher has decided is what the essay should be. So very low level, diminished understanding of good. He again found himself paralyzed. He retreated to his family's apartment, unable to work, unable to study, eventually unable to speak. Much later, he remembered little of the hospitalizations and electroshock therapy that followed in Chicago and Minnesota. That's kind of interesting. I wasn't actually aware that. I guess he would have gone home from Chicago to Minnesota to continue his course of treatment. And with electroshock therapy, I think it's something like 30 sessions. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's really a lot. But he remembered quality. Of course, he, like all of us, experienced quality. But he also came away from his traumatic experience of failure, in which goals and desires were stripped away with a realization about quality beyond definition, beyond self and other, beyond subjects and objects. And he kept thinking about how to explain it. Sorry, let me just look at this a second. But he also came away from his traumatic experience of failure, in which goals and desires were stripped away. All right. Do you remember in Lila where he gives these cases? There was a guy who has a heart attack, and he's lying in a hospital bed and looks at his hand as if he's never seen it before. So we're talking about not stuckness. We're talking about a total blowing apart of static patterns and seeing reality for what it is. A realization about quality beyond definition, beyond self and other, beyond subjects and objects. And he kept thinking about how to explain it. That so beautifully summarizes the experience of all your patterns being blown apart and you coming up against just quality. Back in Minneapolis through the 1960s, Bob worked in industry. In all, his career as a freelance technical writer spanned much of 20 years. The jobs he got for companies as diverse as hospitals, flour millers, mainframe computers, and naval defense provided a rich background in technology. He said many times that tech writing prepared him for Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance in a way that was as important as owning and maintaining a motorcycle. And he, of course, did that. And I think that in order to make it technical, and in Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, there's a couple of things that stand out to me. One is the instruction manual, which is how to put something together isn't necessarily the only way to put something together, but it's the way that makes sense for most people. And the other thing is in Lila, how he writes in the sort of dynamic note card way. But I'm jumping the gun. He's gonna relate this experience to that later. But what's interesting is the way he says it was, or the way she says he thought that it was as important as owning. Look how needy this cat is. It's because I had her on the road. I had her in a box, and now she's not with any of the other cats, and she's in a different place. So she suddenly becomes my best friend. She doesn't act like this at home or in my other home. He said many times that tech writing prepared him for Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance in a way that was as important as owning and maintaining a motorcycle, and he, of course, did that too. He also expanded his knowledge of Eastern religion, learning that he could produce insights of non-duality similar to those he experienced during his Chicago breakdown. One thing I like about this book is it goes a little bit more into, like I said, spirituality. And the way that Wendy's putting it isn't something he's actually said, but it's something we can totally relate to. He hasn't put it like this, insights of non-duality, at least not that I can remember. And he's talking about those states of mind in which patterns are shattered and you're just seeing quality. So that's why he got into Zen, is because the point of Zen meditation is exactly this insight of non-duality. Similar to those he experienced during his Chicago breakdown. In 1957, he attended a conference on Indian philosophy in Stillwater, Minnesota, led in part by John Plott, his friend from India, and David White, a Macalester College professor, who had studied with the Hindu mystic Ramana Maharshi. Do you all know who Ramana Maharshi is? He's like the main non-dual guy. He's someone, he was a mystic who had a profound mystical experience and became just a living non-dual entity and gained followers far and wide. And this was in the 50s, and I think I mentioned before that the 50s was a time in which Indian philosophy was really coming into the consciousness. Now, I know, like, again, stuff happened earlier. I know with the Theosophical Society and Vivekananda, and in the turn of the century. But the 50s is when Buddhism, as we know it to be in such a big part of our culture now, began to enter our awareness as Americans. David's wife, Beverly White, had studied Zen in Japan under Hakun Yasutani. I don't know who that is. Also at the conference, Bob met a former student of David White, a social worker named John Sutherland. We know who that is. John and Bob began a friendship that eventually led to many motorcycle trips, including a cross-country ride in 1968 with John's wife, Sylvia, and Bob's son, Chris. Another summer, Bob and his younger son, Ted, took the bike on another long journey to Churchill, Manitoba, on Hudson Bay. And of course, that rather than the Midwest to the West, that sort of area is more in line with Lila. Not Canada per se, but up the Hudson Bay, upstate New York, etc. Excuse me. Beverly White had set up a group doing Zen meditation called Zazen in their home. In 1972, they invited Dainin Katagiri, who had assisted Shunryu Suzuki at San Francisco Zen Center. Now, if you want a really good Zen book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki is the best. It's fantastic, and it's very short. Minnesota Zen Meditation Center was formed with Katagiri Roshi as abbot and Bob and Nancy Pirsig, as well as teenage Chris and Ted among the members. Katagiri was Bob's primary teacher about Zen. By then, Bob had taken a booklet he had started about motorcycle maintenance, which he had been attempting to fashion into a publishable work, and combined it with an account of the Montana bike trip and what he knew of Zen from the ideas he had been working with in Bozeman and Chicago long before. After being rejected by 121 publishers, Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance found a supportive editor, James Landis, at William Morrow and Company. Most of you all know that tidbit. That's kind of one of the most famous tidbits of the Pirsig Zam myth. Published in 1974, the book struck unexpected success, earning acclaim and readers the world over. Bob began work on a sequel that would elaborate on quality, centering on the question, why do people disagree on what has quality? That's very interesting. That was the question addressed in Lila. And reading it, when I see that written, I can see it in Lila, but it's not the first thing that would have come to mind. Shying away from his sudden celebrity, he acquired a sailboat named Arete and left Minnesota, working and traveling from the Great Lakes to the Caribbean, up and down the Atlantic coast, and across the ocean to England. In 1979, Chris was murdered while a Zen student in San Francisco. I think you all know about that tragedy. In the traumatic shadow of that personal loss, Lila would not be published until 1991. All right, so it was roughly 17 or 18 years that it took him to write it, and maybe that gives you a little bit more understanding why that would be the case. Nancy and Bob had divorced. He and I lived and sailed in Europe for 5 years, and our daughter Nell was born in the Netherlands. Bob started me on a lifetime practice of Zazen, and we eventually settled in South Berwick, Maine. Actually, I could see them in Maine. That is a place I can absolutely see Pirsig. We had originally met when I was a freelance journalist, interviewing him for a feature story I never wrote. I never wrote the article, but throughout our over 40 years together, I paid close attention to his thinking about quality. Again, this is why this book is fantastic if you want to know more about Bob Pirsig, because no one knows him better than she does. Just as we did that night playing Keno at the casino in Nevada, we remembered our relationship to quality whenever we could. All right, I love this. I love this. His goal in his books was to raise people's awareness of its central place. This is what has led me to compile this little volume. And I'll tell you, this if his books are hard for people, if they're hard to, they're long and they don't give you, they're not very explicit about what his philosophy is exactly. Or if they are, they really require a lot of thinking, and a lot of people won't put the effort into it. But this, I think, is something that's really accessible, and I'm so grateful for the fact that Wendy Pirsig did this. For all the decades Bob spent writing, it never came easily. Isn't that interesting? I mean, you read someone like this and you think, oh, well, they're just such a genius. They're so talented. It just comes out of them. No. After Lila, published in his 60s, don't give up, folks, he contemplated other works, but they never materialized. And I don't know if that's a bad thing. The fact that we only have these two amazing and very complete books, in my opinion, when paired together. Would another book have helped? His work in later years involved maintenance of our home, the boat, and the motorcycle he kept for the rest of his life. After his life setbacks, Bob greatly relished the success his books enjoyed, and should have. As some philosophers have noted, they also challenge Western philosophy and science to take on a study of quality and stop thinking of it as vague and unworthy. This book is meant as a reminder of that challenge. Well, I think that would have been inconceivable some time ago, but as you see in this corner, you're starting to see people maybe beginning to see quality, value, as more than vague and unworthy. To see that right hemisphere way of thinking, that more complete, holistic way of understanding. It can be opened anywhere, front to back. It offers some new glimpses into real events in the author's life. It is also an effort to guide the reader along a progression of ideas. I hope that any way you enjoy it, you will find quality. You'll know it when it's there. Perfect. Okay, thanks so much. I hope that made sense. I'll keep going with this. Hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.